Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Well, thank you for joining us. In case you missed it, we are in the midst of a series on authority. And why do we distrust authority? Who are we to trust? Some of our war and tension with the authorities of our world. And this is such a complex topic because it's so global. There are authorities that we are under in some ways that run empires and nations and policies and create laws that have major impact for our world. And there are religious authorities in our midst that establish theological foundations and biblical imagination. And there are more localized authorities in our world, in our communities, in our churches, in our jobs, and even in our families and in our life. And I think we have to do that courageous work of talking about these things, knowing it's incredibly foolish because it's so complex and so dynamic and also so deeply personal. So in our last episode, we were in some ways discussing this hermeneutic of suspicion that has been more familiar in our world for a variety of reasons, and talking about the problem of when we have taken a vow to only distrust authority, and then a sense of what does it mean for Jesus to have authority? Who is it that Jesus authorizes? And we're going to spend more time in this episode taking a look at who are the people we're actually meant to trust and to submit to in a way that is actually more healthy, more biblical, more mutual, and I think can lead to a kind of building and flourishing we're most meant for.
Well, Rachael, let me read what some have called a clobber passage. And it's Romans 13. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. Well, shut up, obey, don't question, do what's right, and you'll be safe. Have I interpreted that passage well?
Well, I mean, I'm also just laughing because in a previous podcast series we did on spiritual abuse, this was actually the passage used by the elders of our church the day that they left the church and had one of the elders come read a letter to let us know we were all in rebellion and we're going to be judged. So this is just taking me back to all kinds of places.
Well, probably not the best place to return to the struggle of that trauma, other than the same passage is quoted as something of the same in Hebrews 13 of be confident about your authorities, obey them. Well, actually, it doesn't say obey; it says submit, and it will bring joy rather than a burden to your leaders. So we're in thick water. I don't know if that's a good metaphor, but we're in complicated waters. So when we begin to mess with this, I think it's important. And again, my Greek is pretty weak, but two things that we need to begin with this passage, and that is, first of all, the verb that's used is not obey, it's submit. And it's a Greek word, hupotasso. And if Paul had wanted to use the word obey, he would have used a Greek phrase, hupokuo. If you want that, it's Hupo, at least transliterated, K-O-U-O. And it's just a beginning point to say, look, he's not saying do whatever authorities demand of you to do. but it's this complicated word, submit. I'm sure for many of our listeners, it's a trigger word. It just immediately clouds the ability to even have a conversation because of all the misuse and the violence done by bad marriages, in one sense, harmful pastors, even political authorities who use this passage in Romans 13 and the one in Hebrews 13. So yeah, we're in the thicket, aren't we?
Yeah. And, I think to get into some of the context of what's being spoken here, especially after Romans 9 through 12, which we don't have time for today, but some of what Paul is engaging with regard to Israel and the people of God and the original blessings spoken over them. But this is a context with more of an empire structure, not necessarily nation states. And in some ways, either an over or under realized eschatology, this sense of either Jesus is fully here, so there's no need to, obey or submit to anyone but him, or Jesus is not here, so we need to make a new kingdom, really just like people throughout history. And so, these are very complex waters. And I do just want to take a moment to speak to the people who are like, I'm not even going to listen to this. Like, you guys are talking about submission. I don't have time for this. I've heard this so many times. You need to submit to authority. And I think our hope would be that we're actually going to be playing with some of the binds of that way the language has been disordered and distorted. Because that's why, Dan, you're making this kind of distinction between a word like submission and a word like obedience. And so hopefully we can get there quickly for those of you who are just like, I don't know about this.
Well, at least no theologian that I've read or any interpreter of the book of Romans, everyone will say this is a tension passage. Paul's not saying when there is wicked and evil people demanding of you to do things that are so contrary to what it means to follow Jesus, don't worry, just do it. So there is a place, unquestionably, for civil disobedience, just as there's a place to not do what authorities are requiring of you to do in a context that may be at work or in a marriage or in a friendship. So we're going to come back to this category of mutual submission in a later episode, but at least to underscore that submission is putting yourself under another for the sake of serving a greater good. And that sense is like helping push a car out of mud. You just can't put your hands on it and sort of push a little bit. You've got to literally give yourself over to doing all that you can do to remove this vehicle from the massive mess that it's in. So to submit is to commit yourself to the better, to the good, to the life that is meant to be lived, which is so important to hear. If you were to obey certain authorities, you would actually not be submitting to their good and to the good of the greater organization, institution, marriage, friendships, etc. Where we are is the question, even in the Romans 13 passage, is what authority? And again, not that anyone knows how to pronounce Koine Greek, but for those of you who have a better sense of it, the phrase that Paul uses as to the authority is a phrase of ekousias, hyperkouesis, and this term hyperecho implies a quality superior, not all authority, but somebody who bears a kind of qualitative goodness. That's the authority. In other words, he's not just saying every person or every institutional structure where there is authority that you are submit to them. It is you are to submit to those who bear a level of likeness to the reality of the goodness of God and how Jesus is our authority and how he gives authority over to others for the sake of addressing the brokenness of this world.
I was just going to say, so I think we have to hold all the stories of how Jesus engaged and who he authorized, because we're so disordered by how we perceive authority and who has power and who is to be in some ways obeyed or submitted to. Like, Jesus is constantly authorizing people who we would not necessarily say, oh yes, that is someone to follow. And I think that's why this is such a wild conversation to be having, because what immediately comes to mind for us might actually look very different than what Jesus is kind of breaking open or bringing with this sense of, we have to hold Pentecost in this story and what's happening with the Spirit falling on people and authorizing people. We have to hold that, some of the first church leaders, like even Paul himself, are people who were the least deserving of that place and yet still had tremendous privilege and power. So
now that we get into that language, for example, somebody who speaks and says, I speak to you with the voice of God. God told me you're not to marry this person. God told me that you are meant to be in this ministry, and if you don't, your life is not going to be used of God. When people assert the power of the voice of God, already what we can say is that is somebody who does not fit the category of that notion of hyperechoisis, of the qualitatively superior authority, is not somebody who's operating out of their own narcissism, out of their own power and control, because that's not what authority does on behalf of Jesus.
Yeah, and I think I would love for us to get into who is this kind of authority. I have to own, I probably have a little bit of a reaction to the word superior, but I love where you're playing with the text here in the sense of even redefining what does that mean? Because the truth is, if you're actually authorized by God, by the Spirit, living in such a way that you are meant to bring about goodness and cultivate a sense of safety and a context for people to flourish and bring their gifts, typically you don't actually have to go around telling people you have authority. They grant it to you.
Absolutely.
They give you authority through their respect, through their participation, and also it is in some ways your service to them, your honor that you give, the capacity. I mean, we're back in attachment categories. We just were in attachment. We're back in that place of your capacity to repair and to repent and to bear your own human fragility and that kind of sobriety. These are the places where authority is granted and given. And I do see authority and superior authority, if we're going to use that language, being something that is actually mutually given. We are authorized by God, but there's something playing out in community when we bring ourselves as servants to the community that actually authorizes.
Well, what a great lead in to this passage of Luke 22, and starting with verse 25. Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors, which is fascinating. The people who are using authority say, I'm your benefactor. I'm here for you. But Jesus says, but you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. We could go on in that passage, but the bottom line is he's saying the people who are sitting at the table are the ones who have power. The people who are serving don't have power. You're to be like the people who don't have power serving, yet you also have authority because you're like me in that I am not intrusive. I don't violate and use power and shame, fear and judgment to corral and to use even the voice I have, which is the voice of God, to speak to you in a way that limits and violates your freedom.
I mean, Jesus is always authorizing people with his authority. He's always extending a sense of empowerment, dignity, in some ways a call to life to people in his midst. And people respond to that. And not always, it's back to that, like to some, the aroma of the gospel is beautiful and stunning and life-giving, and to some it is the very fragrance of death, so it's not like everyone responds well to that kind of authorization because it feels deeply threatening to the power structures that are. And I just love that language of like to serve. And I think we could speak a little bit to and people who understand in some ways the precariousness of what it is to have power, who are repentant, who are vulnerable, and who are, reluctant or sober, or just have a deep sense of, I need to bring the gifts and the stewardship and the service I've been tasked and given to bring, not cowardly. I need to bring it boldly, but I also need to bring it with a kind of tentativeness that understands power is not neutral.
Oh, what a
it
phrase.
Has impact.
Yes. I mean, I need leaders who are at some level suspicious of their own power, but don't refuse to use it because that would be cowardly. But on the other hand, open the door to a diversity of perspectives simply because we have to have conflict in the midst of decision making. And that conflict is not, in one sense, proof that we're not doing well. It's at least the varied voices of different perspectives, a kind of diversity of thought, of life experience, of race, of age, of gender, that allows for no yes men or women, but also a sense that, yes, leaders with all that still have to make decisions that will often hurt or create struggle for a contingency of the people they're serving. So we're not saying being a leader is easy, but what we're saying is that the call to leadership in any form has to have enough brokenness and enough openness that it isn't operating with the authority that Jesus is, in some sense, mocking when he says, and you call yourself a benefactor, when in fact you're sitting at the table asking other people to serve you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I just love that. I mean, it's really hard for me to follow leaders who surround themselves with people who just tell them what they want to hear, because I'm always thinking, oh, you don't trust your own leadership. You don't trust the authority you've been given. And again, we're back to this reality of like, people are broken. People are human size, and our systems are broken and human size, and our relationships are not as we would most want them to be, or what we're most made for. So what is that line? What is the tension that's meant to be held, and how do we discern what's good and holy, even in the midst of complexity, and what is actually disordered, dysfunctional, and wicked?
Well, to me, what you're asking is, how do we trust broken leaders? And I think my first category is don't idealize anybody. the fact is no one's got a corner on the truth, and no one's got a corner on maturity. So if you don't have leaders who are actually wanting to grow, then the question is, don't make demands and expectations for a form of elegance nobody can provide. On the other hand, why would you put yourself under authority that already clearly does not have a heart to be honest, to be open, that has both curiosity and a certain suspicion regarding their own power?
Mm-hmm. Or like another word I would put in here is like a lot of fragility, like needs to believe that they're only good and can't bear that they're human. And what is that accountability, and not in a way that's a group of people who then feel like they have full access to critique you all the time or to hold every wrong against you. Like we have a lot of biblical precedent to say that's not good and right. But what and accountability to me looks like, what are you doing to understand how to be more whole, how to be more human? What are the ways, as someone in authority, you're submitting to other authorities, you're submitting to places where you get to grow and pursue healing, and to learn and to grow in wisdom?
Well, I think we've got a bit more work to do in terms of how do we trust? How do we submit and trust? How do we do this in a way that's mutual? And then how do we keep interacting with the various authorities? You and I both have a lot of bosses. And
yeah, we do.
I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for the people who are above us, leadership-wise, in the Allender Center. I'm grateful that I work for the president of the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, Derek McNeil. I'm under a board, and in one sense, I don't trust anybody who's not under authority. Even if you are an authority, who are you under? Often is a more telling reality. But let's come back to this question of what is submission? What does it mean to interact with those who do have authority? And at least conclude with a bit more confusion than what we've left people with now.
Sounds like a plan.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.